Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
My background was in freelance graphic design, but after the economic downturn hit, I needed something more stable. That's how I found myself at one of the biggest marketing firms in the city. The transition from working in my pajamas to wearing business casual was rough, but I was grateful for the opportunity. The company culture was actually pretty great. My boss was this amazing woman who treated everyone like equals and fostered creativity. She'd been in the industry for 15 years and still maintained this infectious enthusiasm for every project. The rest of my immediate team was equally awesome. We had this casual, collaborative vibe that made even the most stressful deadlines bearable. This incident happened about 6 months into my time there. I just finished presenting some designs for a major client campaign, and my boss was giving me feedback. We were in this little casual meeting area near our team's section. You know those file cabinet drawer things with cushions on top that offices have? I was sitting on one of those while my boss sat in a proper chair. We were deep in conversation about tweaking the color scheme when she showed up. Let's call her Karen, though she was probably too young to be a traditional Karen, maybe 30 at most. She worked with a team next to ours and had somehow clawed her way into a mid-level management position despite having the personality of an angry hornet. Karen was notorious for putting people down, especially in front of others. She'd make these cutting remarks about people's work, their clothes, their lunch choices, literally anything she could criticize. The worst part was how she'd do it with this fake, concerned voice, like she was doing you a favor by pointing out your flaws. Most people just tried to avoid her, but since our teams often collaborated, that wasn't always possible. My boss was in the middle of suggesting we adjust the blue to be slightly more muted when Karen interrupted us. She asked if she could join, mentioning she wanted to discuss the client presentation from earlier. She didn't wait for an answer before pulling up a chair. I was sitting casually, one leg crossed over the other, absently fiddling with my shoelace while we talked. That's when she struck. Karen let out an exaggerated gasp and exclaimed with disgust about me touching the bottom of my shoe. She made sure to emphasize how gross it was and questioned if I knew how disgusting the bottom of a shoe could be. Her voice was loud enough that several people nearby turned to look. The conversation screeched to a halt, and my boss and I exchanged looks. I could see it in my boss's eyes. She was tired of Karen's behavior too. Maybe it was the months of watching her bully others, or maybe it was just the perfect moment to finally say something. But I felt unusually calm as I responded. I asked her directly why she would call me out like that, suggesting the only reason could be that she was being an a-hole. Her mouth actually dropped open. I don't think anyone had ever called her out so directly before. She quickly tried to recover, putting on her fake, concerned voice again. She attempted to backtrack, claiming she was just worried about me getting sick because of all the germs on the bottom of shoes. I shot back that if she was really concerned, she could have sent me a message on the company chat or told me privately instead of trying to humiliate me in front of people. I made sure to point out how rude and disrespectful her behavior was. Karen's face went through about 5 different expressions in 2 seconds. She clearly hadn't expected this to backfire so spectacularly. After a moment of awkward silence, she cleared her throat and awkwardly tried to change the subject back to the client presentation. She rushed through some vague feedback about the project, barely making eye contact, then practically speed-walked back to her desk. As soon as she was out of earshot, my boss lost it. She excitedly told me that she'd never seen anyone put Karen in her place before, saying I had absolutely roasted her. The story spread through the office pretty quickly. For the next few weeks, I noticed other people starting to stand up to Karen's comments too. It was like everyone had just been waiting for someone to break the spell. She eventually transferred to another department, supposedly for career growth opportunities. But everyone knew she couldn't handle working in an environment where people wouldn't tolerate her behavior anymore. The company actually promoted me to lead designer 6 months later, putting me at the same level as Karen had been. My boss later told me that my ability to handle difficult personalities professionally but firmly was one of the reasons they chose me for the role. My husband and I had been married for 5 years when things started getting really weird with his sister. She'd always been possessive of him, but it got way worse after our wedding. At first, it was just her showing up unannounced at our house multiple times a week. Then she started calling him at all hours, claiming she had emergencies that turned out to be things like needing help choosing what to wear for a date or wanting someone to watch movies with her. My husband kept making excuses for her, saying she was just going through a rough patch after her divorce. The real trouble started when I got pregnant. She completely lost it. She started telling everyone that I had trapped her brother and that I was faking the pregnancy to keep him away from his real family. She even started showing up at my workplace, causing scenes and telling my coworkers that I was a horrible person who stole her brother. The breaking point came when she tried to tamper with my car's brakes. We had security cameras installed after all her harassment, and we caught her red-handed. That's when we finally got the restraining order. She wasn't allowed within 500 feet of me, our house, or my workplace, but she didn't care. She kept violating it, and the police had already given her multiple warnings. Yesterday, she crossed the line again. I was shopping at the grocery store when I heard her voice behind me. She mockingly called me a brother, stealing witch. I told her she needed to leave since she was violating the restraining order. She arrogantly replied that she could go wherever she wanted since it was a public place, and that I couldn't keep her from shopping. When I told her I was calling the police, she dared me to do it, saying they couldn't stop her from seeing her brother. She started following me around the store, knocking items out of my cart and screaming about how I'd ruined her family. The store security tried to intervene, telling her she needed to leave the premises. She responded aggressively, telling them not to touch her and bragging that her father was friends with the police chief. I had already called 911 and 2 police officers arrived within minutes. They recognized her immediately. She'd had run-ins with them before. The first officer told her she was under arrest for violating the restraining order. She tried claiming she was pregnant to avoid arrest, but the second officer called her out, mentioning she'd used that excuse last time and asking her to put her hands behind her back. That's when she completely lost it. She tried to run, but the officers caught her easily. When they were putting her in handcuffs, she started screaming so loudly that people were filming with their phones. She threatened everyone present, saying her brother would sue them all and accusing the officers of police brutality. They managed to get her into the back of the police cruiser, but that's when things got even more disgusting. She started deliberately urinating all over the backseat, grinning like she'd just won some kind of victory. She taunted the officers about having to clean up her mess, calling them pigs. Then she started spitting at the officers through the cage partition. One of the officers had to go back to their car to get a spit hood. The first officer gave her a final warning about the spitting, telling her they'd have to put the hood on if she continued. In response, she spat directly at his face and mockingly dared them to put the hood on, adding another threat about suing them. They put the spit hood on her, but she kept screaming and thrashing around. By the time they got her to the station, she'd managed to kick out one of the cruiser's windows. The entire incident was caught on the grocery store's security cameras, the police body cams, and about a dozen shoppers' phones. The videos went viral on social media, and now she's facing multiple charges: violating the restraining order, assault on law enforcement, destruction of government property, and public indecency. She's still in jail because no one in the family is willing to bail her out this time. My husband finally realized how dangerous his sister's obsession had become and has completely cut contact with her. The prosecutor is pushing for maximum penalties given her history of violations, and there's talk about mandatory psychiatric evaluation. I heard from one of the officers that she's still causing problems in jail, but now she's learning that her actions have real consequences. Apparently, her cellmates don't appreciate her entitled attitude, and the guards are much less patient with her antics than the police were. I've been in the Navy for a few years now, and this story still makes me chuckle whenever I think about it. It's about how following orders to the letter can sometimes lead to some pretty interesting situations. When I first started my job on the ship, I was the lowest ranking person in my department. Life on board was pretty straightforward. We wore our work coveralls while on duty, and we could wear regular clothes when coming to and leaving the ship while we were at our home port. One day we had to move the ship up the river to load some weapons for an upcoming training exercise. It was only supposed to be a week-long trip, and we weren't going far, about an hour's drive by car or 4 hours by ship. Since we weren't going to any other ports and would be coming back to our regular spot before the actual training exercise, I didn't bother bringing my formal uniforms. I just brought what I needed for work on the ship. That's when things got interesting. Out of nowhere, the medical department scheduled appointments for everyone at a small clinic near the weapons station. They didn't ask if we were available or anything, they just made the appointments and told us to show up. I immediately went to my supervisor to explain my problem. I told him I didn't have my formal uniforms with me, which were required for medical appointments. He was incredulous, demanding to know how I could be without my uniforms. When I pointed out there wasn't any specific rule about which uniforms we needed to keep on board for local movements like this, he simply stated that I was required to have an inspection-ready sea bag available at all times. Then he wrote me up for it. I accepted the write-up. Rules are rules after all. When we got back home that weekend, I moved all my military uniforms to the ship. Every single one. I made sure I had a perfect inspection-ready sea bag on board, just like they wanted. Fast forward a couple of years. I'm now a more senior sailor, and I had planned leave to go re-enlist in my hometown. The commanding officer had approved my leave, even though it meant missing a last-minute rescheduled trip. While I was away, my department failed an important inspection. They rescheduled everything, and now they wanted me to come back early to help with the re-inspection. My department head called me with a demand that I cut my leave short and return the next day, saying the inspectors would be there first thing in the morning. I explained that changing my flight tickets would cost me thousands of dollars, and since my leave was approved by the commanding officer, I would need his direct order to change my plans. When he emphasized how crucial the inspection was for our deployment, I acknowledged his point but reminded him that if I was ordered to spend thousands of my own dollars because of someone else's failure, I might reconsider my plans to re-enlist. They quickly backed down and agreed I could return on my original date. But here's where it gets good. They arranged for me to ride the water taxi out to the ship with all the senior officers who were conducting the inspection. The day before I was due back, my supervisor called to ask what uniform I would be wearing for the water taxi the next day. I reminded him with a hint of satisfaction that all my uniforms were on the ship. You know, from that time he wrote me up for not having them on board. When he asked me to clarify what I meant by all my uniforms being on the ship, I explained that after getting written up, I had followed orders precisely and moved every single uniform to the ship. I told him my only options were some clean coveralls at home or my civilian clothes. There was a long silence on the phone. The next morning I showed up at the dock in my civilian clothes. Picture this. A bunch of high-ranking officers in their crisp uniforms, and then there's me, in regular clothes, getting on the same water taxi for an hour-long ride to the ship. Eventually, one of the senior officers asked why I wasn't in uniform. I explained, trying to keep my face straight, that I had once been written up for not having my uniforms on the ship, so I had made sure that would never happen again by keeping them all there. Unfortunately, that meant I didn't have any with me now. The officers tried to hide their smirks, while my supervisor looked like he wanted to disappear. They couldn't even say anything because I was following their exact orders from before. That 1-hour boat ride was the most awkwardly satisfying experience of my naval career. My supervisor never mentioned uniforms to me again, and I made sure to keep a spare set at home after that, but only after getting written permission to do so. I've been running our city's largest volunteer organization for the past 5 years. It started as a small group of friends helping at local food banks, but grew into something much bigger. Now we coordinate with hospitals, shelters, schools, you name it. It's rewarding work, but managing over 200 volunteers isn't always sunshine and roses. There's this one woman in particular, let's call her Karen, who's been a thorn in my side since she joined 2 years ago. She's one of those people who does just enough work to be able to brag about it on social media, but spends more time criticizing others than actually helping. My daughter was born with a rare condition that requires surgery every few years to correct issues with her spine. She's the bravest 12-year-old I know, but this last surgery was quite rough. The hospital had her on some strong pain medication that made her violently ill. We're talking projectile vomiting across the room, kinda sick. After that traumatic experience, she refused to take any more pain meds, even though she desperately needed them. Last year, I was late to our annual winter clothing drive because my daughter was throwing up all morning. Karen made such a big deal about it, telling everyone how some people just can't handle responsibility and how she would never let personal issues interfere with her commitments. Easy for her to say. Her biggest responsibility is managing her Instagram account. This year's clothing drive was scheduled just 4 days after my daughter's latest surgery. I had been up for 3 nights straight, holding my baby, while she cried in pain, trying to convince her to take even the mildest pain reliever. By Friday morning, I was running on nothing but coffee and maternal instinct. I walked into the community center 15 minutes late. The volunteers were already sorting donations into piles, and Karen was standing there with her arms crossed, tapping her foot. When she saw me, she made a snide comment about me finally deciding to show up. I tried to be polite and apologized to everyone for being late, but Karen wouldn't let it go. She asked me sarcastically what my excuse was this year, clearly referencing last year's incident. I was too exhausted to filter my response. I told her bluntly that my daughter had been without pain medicine from her surgery for 48 hours and had spent the night shrieking in pain while I held her. I apologized again for the 15-minute delay, but my tone made it clear I wasn't really sorry at all. The room went silent. Karen's face turned red, but before she could respond, one of our senior volunteers intervened. They asked Karen to speak privately in the corner. From where I stood, I could hear parts of their conversation. The senior volunteer was telling Karen this was the last straw and that her attitude had been a problem for months. Karen tried to defend herself, claiming she was just trying to maintain professional standards, but the senior volunteers shut her down. They reminded her that this was a volunteer organization and we were here to help others, not tear them down. Karen didn't take the criticism well. Before storming out, she announced dramatically to everyone that she would be taking her services elsewhere. Her exit was followed by 3 other volunteers immediately approaching me with offers to take over my duties for the day so I could go home to my daughter. That was 6 months ago. Karen now volunteers at a rival organization across town, where I hear she's making everyone just as miserable. Meanwhile, our group has never been stronger. Turns out removing one toxic person can improve everyone's morale. As for my daughter, she eventually agreed to try a different pain medication, one that didn't make her sick. She is fully recovered now and even helps out at some of our events. She says she wants to run the organization someday. Maybe I'm biased, but I think she'll do a better job than I ever did. She already knows the most important lesson about leadership. Kindness matters more than being right. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.